All right, news in detail. Now, the United Nations Security Council has passed a resolution calling for urgent action to get more humanitarian aid into Gaza. The move comes after days of delays as UN members negotiated on a draft text that was palatable for all those on the Security Council. DD India's William Denselow reports from UN headquarters in New York.
After numerous delays and plenty of diplomatic wrangling and negotiations, finally the Security Council felt in a position to take this draft resolution to a vote. The United States and Russia abstained. They were the two nations to do so.
We know so much more needs to be done to address this humanitarian crisis and to lay the groundwork for a lasting peace. And let's be clear, Hamas has no interest in a lasting peace. Hamas is determined to repeat the horrors of October 7th over and over and over again. And that is why the United States supports Israel's right to protect its people from acts of terror. And I'll note that the resolution does not support any steps that would leave Hamas in power, which in turn would undermine the prospects for a two-state solution.
But crucially, they did not use their power of a veto, which meant that with 13 nations of the 15 on the Security Council approving this resolution, it was adopted.
We supported this resolution, which will streamline aid checks so we can massively scale up the humanitarian response. It demands the immediate and unconditional release of hostages, and it calls for steps towards a sustainable cessation of hostilities.
What it calls for? Well, it calls for urgent steps to immediately allow the safe, unhindered and expanded humanitarian access and to create the conditions for a sustainable cessation of hostilities. That is a marked difference from the language we saw earlier this week that called for urgent and sustainable cessation of hostilities. The resolution also calls for the UN to appoint a coordinator to establish a UN mechanism for accelerating the provision of humanitarian relief consignments to the Palestinian enclave. It calls for the immediate release of Israeli hostages and for all sides to respect international humanitarian law. Despite not using its power of a veto, Russia was noticeably unhappy with the draft text it was voting on, even proposing an amendment calling for the language to be strengthened, calling again for a suspension of hostilities. That amendment, though, was vetoed by the US. Moscow's representative Vasily Nebenzia saying that the US had shown shameful and cynical tactics in promoting what was described by Nebenzia as a toothless resolution. As far as Israel is concerned, well, they said that the UN Security Council should focus more on condemning Hamas and freeing Israeli hostages than negotiating this text. We heard from the UAE, who was a sponsor of this resolution, saying that while it isn't perfect, there are real hopes that this can at least facilitate more humanitarian aid to enter Gaza, as well as to see more done to protect humanitarian workers. Crucially, we have also heard from UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres reacting to this draft resolution. He says he hopes it'll make a difference on the ground. He has laid out some of the humanitarian concerns. He says that 85% of the population in Gaza currently displaced. He said that the healthcare system is on its knees. He warns that a quarter of the population in Gaza are facing catastrophic levels of hunger. He says that while this UN Security Council resolution is a positive step, he warns that the only way to end what he describes as a nightmare for people in Gaza is to see a ceasefire come into effect. William Denselow in New York, reporting for DD India.